To understand the space race, you must first understand the events that led up to it. The Cold War. The Big Three. The Americans, the British, and the Russians were allies during World War II. These allied forces united to defeat the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan. However, this alliance was not to last and ended in 1945. During the 1940s, America decided to no longer get involved in European affairs. President Truman, in his Truman Doctrine of 1947, focused on giving aid to countries that were facing communist threats. In 1959, Fidel Castro, through violent revolution, overthrew the then Cuban leader Fulgencio Batista, who was friendly with America. Castro allied with Russia and became highly dependent on their aid. Cuba, just 90 miles off the Florida coast, became an immediate threat and a major talking point in presidential candidate John F. Kennedy's political campaigns. Kennedy promised a tough stance on stamping out communism. In a failed military attempt, Kennedy sent Cuban exiles in an invasion of their home country. Most were killed and injured, and tensions were increased between the two countries of Cuba and the U.S. This failed mission was known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. 6 weeks after the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, President Kennedy met with Russian leader Nikita Khrushchev during the Vienna summit. It was clear that tensions remained high between the two leaders. Khrushchev commented on America's involvement in the then divided Berlin, that the USSR must respond and it will respond, and that it is up to the US to decide where there will be war or peace. President Kennedy responded, "Then, Mr. Chairman, there will be war. It will be a cold winter." 2 months later, the Soviets built the Berlin Wall. The events of the Cold War heavily influenced what would become known as the space race, as the continuing rivalry between the Soviets and Americans caused the two nations to try to one-up each other in weaponry, technology, and space exploration. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union successfully launched the first artificial satellite into space. It was called Sputnik 1, and it caught the world's attention. This led to fears that the Soviets had capabilities to launch long-range ballistic missiles that might reach the US. They later launched Sputnik 2 into the Earth's orbit with a Russian dog named Laika along for the ride. In response, in January of 1958, the US successfully launched their first artificial satellite, Explorer 1. 6 months later, Congress passed the National Aeronautics and Space Act, commonly called the Space Act, which established NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, later that year. On April 12, 1961, Russia launched the first man into space, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin. He orbited Earth for 1 hour and 29 minutes and landed in his homeland of Russia. Yuri's trip beat astronaut Alan Shepard, who 23 days later became the first American man to orbit Earth in a Mercury space capsule called the Freedom 7. About a month later, on May 25, 1961, President Kennedy addressed Congress about human exploration on the moon. In this famous speech, Kennedy said, "But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win, and the others too." In the competition to reach the moon, Alexei became the first man to walk in space. He left his space capsule, the Vauxhall 12, as he floated outside while attached to the craft for 12 minutes. Although he faced complications with his suit and had to come inside, this was a major step in space exploration. Another major step for America was NASA's voyage of the Mariner 4 satellite. On July 15, 1965, it made its voyage deeper into space than any other craft and successfully took pictures of the red planet Mars. There were tragic outcomes for both countries in 1967. In January of that year, the next mission for the Americans was Apollo 1. Astronauts Edward H. White, Virgil Gus Grissom, and Roger B. Schaff sadly died when the craft, instead of successfully launching, burst into flames where it stood. Prussian cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov was also killed in October of 1967 when his ship caught fire and he was trapped inside upon re-entry to the Earth's atmosphere. On July 20th, 1969, history was made when the Apollo 11, manned by Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Buzz Aldrin, arrived at the moon after a 76-hour journey. Armstrong and Aldrin separated from the craft on the Eagle lunar module and landed on the moon. As the craft touched down, Armstrong radioed back to mission control with the famous words, "The Eagle has landed." About 2 hours later, Armstrong climbed out of the craft and became the first man to walk on the moon. Millions of people watched in awe as the event was broadcast live to their televisions as Armstrong said the now famous words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Aldrin joined him 19 minutes later for a walk, and they planted the American flag on the moon. In April of 1970, the Apollo 13 was launched with astronauts Jim Lovell, Fred Hayes, and Jack Swigert aboard. The mission started off well, but the explosion of an oxygen tank left the men in a dangerous situation. Lovell radioed to mission control, "Houston, we've had a problem. We've had a main B bus undervolt." The world watched in concern that they might not make it back, but miraculously, all 3 men made it back to Earth safely. In April of 1971, the USSR launched the first unmanned space station, the Salyut 1. 3 cosmonauts were launched in a craft called the Soyuz 10 in hope of docking with the space station and remaining on board for 30 days. They were unable to dock and were forced to return home, barely making it back safely due to problems with the air supply. However, Salyut 1 was still a big accomplishment in space exploration, as other missions to the craft became successful. The next advancement in space exploration was the Apollo 15 mission. The mission began on July 26, 1971, and was the 4th to land on the moon. This mission was important because it marked the first time that the moon was explored in an LAV, or Lunar Rover Vehicle, allowing astronauts David Scott and James Irwin to travel farther and longer on the moon's surface than anyone had before. On July 15, 1975, the Apollo-Soyuz mission began. Cosmonauts Alexei Leonov and Valery Kubasov piloted the Soyuz 19, and American astronauts Thomas Stafford, Vance Brand, and Donald Slayton rode aboard the Apollo CSM. On July 17th, above the Atlantic Ocean, the crafts met in space. The hatches were opened and the crews shook hands, exchanged gifts, and joined each other on the Soyuz as the world looked on. This was the symbolic end of the space race. Future scientists and space explorers would work together going forward for the benefit of all mankind.